those various jurisdictions continue to tax at those rates for that base value. For the incremental value, the tax is simply the total tax rate for all of those jurisdictions combined. So that total tax rate down here at the bottom, that $20, is what's considered the tax, the TID tax rate, and that's what's applied to the incremental value. So that's, I think that's the 10 to 40,000 foot view, how TIF works. And so return on investment, this data again is somewhat outdated, but I think it's a very important slide. In 2017, Ehlers reviewed all TIDs that were closed between 2009 and 2016 and found that for every $1 of public investment, an average of $4.66 in new property value was created. And that does not even consider the value of jobs created, payroll taxes, other types of income tax. It's just simply property value. So, that's an enormous return on public investment in TID. So, as we look a little bit closer into how TID is applied in various situations, one of the standards that's used in determining what developments, what projects are considered TIF eligible is the but-for test. And it's a standard that must be applied by the village as well as the Joint Review Board when making decisions about how to use TIF. And essentially the idea is, but for the use of TIF for a particular project, that proposed development would not occur either as proposed within the same time frame or with the same level of value. And the idea is, finding what level of investment and what level of development the village is comfortable with or is seeking, and does this proposed development meet those needs? If not, how does TIF help, and is the project only going to take place if TIF is used? And to continue on that, there's certainly ways that you need to prove that, but for the use of TIF, a project would not go forward in those same manners. And the number of ways that you can prove the but-for test using an independent third-party reviewer of developers, sources, uses, and cash flows, essentially looking at a development with TIF and without TIF, comparing the two, and then determining the appropriate amount of TIF, or whether it is appropriate to use TIF and how much. Challenge site, obviously if there's environmental remediation that needs to take place, those are the types of things that TIF is extremely effective for using extensive public infrastructure costs or lack of economic development in community. Using TIF as a means of sort of incentivizing and providing an anchor for private development in a community. Ultimately, though, with the but-for test, it's a village and Joint Review Board judgment call, and up to those entities to determine that the but-for test has been satisfied. So the last slide that I'm going to talk about before handing it back over to Dawn is the different types of districts and their maximum life. So there's several different types of districts that you can use depending on the nature of the project or the nature of the area that is being targeted for development. Firstly, this first line just states that prior to October 1st, 1995, there were no different TID types. All TIDs were 27-year TIDs, and they didn't have to specify whether they were for a specific purpose or not. That all changed in 1995 with the blight rehab designation. And so that's a current TID type, blight rehab, and that has a 27-year maximum life. Then there's an industrial designation. There was an industrial post 1995, pre-04, which is the 23-year maximum life PID, and then there's an industrial or mixed-use designation that was post October 1st, 2004. Those PIDs have a 20-year maximum life. And a lot of the differentiation here is, you know, what is the use of the PID? I mean, when you're looking at a site, is it going to be used for industrial development, for mixed use, which has either commercial or industrial or residential components? Is it blight rehab? I mean, is there a finding related to the current use of the area that Dawn's going to talk about in the next slide? And then there's a newer type of PID called an environmental remediation PID, which is exactly as it sounds like, mainly for environmental mitigation and cleaning up those types of sites. So there's a pre-2017 23-year ER PID, and then a post-2017 27-year ER PID. And then all of the different types of PIDs have potential extensions for use. As an example, the blight rehab PID has a 3-year automatic extension. The pre-1995, I believe, has an automatic 4-year extension. That just means the JRB needs to pass a resolution or authorize or adopt a resolution approving the extension, and that's as simple as it gets. Other types of extensions are a little bit more involved, but I think that covers that. So I will turn it back over to Dawn now to take over.
First, I'd like to just make a couple other comments on the last slide that Jonathan went through. As you create a tax increment district, you make a determination of what type of district that you're creating, and that will define the number of years that district becomes open. And the criteria basically is at least 50% of the area in the district has to meet one of these findings. And so the village has actually kind of looked at that already and kind of concluded that this area would be appropriate as a blight district. And so the next slide kind of talks a little bit about that blight determination. So we need to establish that at least 50% of the area of the district meets the statutory definition of blight. And I stuck this slide in here, and this was right out of the Department of Revenue's website with their what they consider blighted areas. And so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with this, but we felt that there's some remediation issues and some obsolescence within the facilities that are located on the site, and some additional property that are coming in that may have some additional remediation that would meet the statutory finding to determine this as a blight district. And again, it's 50% of the area of the district, and we look at it by acreage of parcels. You know, there was consideration of a mixed-use district, but there were a few conditions that need to be met to make a mixed-use district that this district probably would not quite satisfy. And the area of residential development, which would include the multifamily and single-family homes, would exceed the limit of 35%. There also is a condition when there's a mixed-use development that the residential development is an average of at least 3 units per acre. So that we hadn't actually gone through the math of, but I think what's the beneficial of being able to get the blight designation or rehabilitation designation is that you get 27 years to recover any project costs, which many times those type of districts take a little longer to recover. So with that, we'll move on to some additional detail on eligible project cost. So this is a list of the type of expenditures that are clearly defined as eligible project cost in tax increment law. And you know, if there are any issues that become a little bit gray areas, the Department of Revenue has stated in their statute or their guidance to local government that the final determination of that should be done by your local professional attorney. The Department of Revenue does not make those judgment calls as it approves the tax increment district. It's going to rely on the local jurisdiction's consideration. But here's a list of the types of things, and some of them just are common sense. So if there's a need for significant public improvements, and that would include street, water, sewer projects, any cost to undertake financing, real property cost to assemblage or acquire property, or in some cases land write down. If property values are extremely high for development, the TIF can help write down the cost of that land. Any other professional services would be your engineering professionals, your attorney professionals, your finance professionals, those types of things, surveyors, environmental remediation staff, and so on and so forth. You are entitled to recover some organizational costs and administrative costs on an annual basis. TIF does allow to make contributions to community development authorities to establish loan programs or to just set up programs with the CDA to use in the future. It's one of those types of things. If there is a need to relocate individuals or businesses, those costs are eligible. A proration of infrastructure costs, so if there's municipal-wide infrastructure that's being done, a proration that actually benefits the district itself can be allocated to the as a project cost to the district. And one that is referred to as CAS grants under state law. This would be like any direct development incentives. A developer's agreement would be required in all cases, and we'll get into a little bit more detail on that as well. But many times we see districts being created that you're incentivizing someone to come to the site. So you provide them a cash grant as that incentive. They can use it on any cost they may have to redevelop the site. And it's just specifically identified as an incentive or a cash grant. Any environmental remediation cost is certainly eligible. And within, I think it was in 2000, it might have been later than that, at a point, maybe it was in 15, the state allowed you to undertake project cost within a half-mile of the district boundary, which has been a real advantage. So if you have a street that's coming into a tax increment district, but say an intersection is outside of it and the intersection needs improvement, you can identify that project as an eligible expense and put it into the tax increment district. I do want to point out that any costs that are within the half mile, you need to be able to relate the benefit and the purpose to the tax increment district itself. So bringing utilities to a site, those are eligible expenses if you can prove that they're benefiting the district or the development itself within the district. And that would probably be the case here in Elm Grove. However, if there's any other revenues to benefiting properties outside the district, for instance, if there's any special assessments that are assigned, or if there's any other collection of costs for someone to access those utilities, they would have to offset the utility or the tax increment district cost itself. So if the TIF is paying for it, then any other revenue sources would have to offset that. So, but it does allow some flexibility to be able to do that outside the boundaries. Then the next slide we'll talk about is the prohibited project cost. And some of this makes, it's common sense. You can't build an administrative building, a police department, fire department, recreational facility, or a library, school district using tax increment revenue. It's not the intent. It's to promote economic development. So those would be non-eligible project cost or expanding facilities that are typically financed by utility user fees. That would not be directly related to the tax increment district, or any general governmental expenses that is unrelated to the TIF. As I said, you can cover administrative expenses, which can encompass auditing fees, actual staff time that's spent to administer the life of the district. Those are eligible costs. So one other thing that's an ineligible expense is that's newly platted residential development. So they only allowable to use TIF dollars for newly platted, and that's areas that haven't previously been platted, would be limited to a mixed-use district. So this district has some single-family homes in it that would be considered newly platted. So any costs associated with the district should be, that they would benefit them should be avoided as eligible costs. Now, if there's a benefit to looping utilities that provide protection to the main focus of the development, or in this case, on the sister site, the multifamily. If there's a need to loop a utility, then there could be a proration of that cost that would be prorated between the multifamily and perhaps the residential development. And the TIF could support the prorated force benefiting the multifamily development or any other properties that are within the district itself that are commercial in nature. So Jonathan, if you'll proceed to the next slide. So how do these costs get paid for upfront? So as Jonathan explained in how tax increment revenues are generated from new development in the site, and it's those future taxes that ultimately pay for the cost of putting in improvements. If they're done by the village in advance of the improvements taking place and you're recovering the cost of that advance contribution, there are a few different ways to do that. You usually have to raise the capital first in order to undertake the projects. One, you certainly can use, I don't have it listed on here, but you could certainly use any cash you have on hand or funds you have on hand that you could apply and then recover in it over time and replace those funds. Not typically done by many jurisdictions. Most do not have funds that they have on hand and they don't want to tie it up to be used for a longer period of time, in some cases up to 20, 25 years. So the village can issue general obligation debt. So there's pros and cons of that, and there's risk associated with doing that. The pros of issuing general obligation debt, it's the cheapest way, other than using cash on hand perhaps, but it's the cheapest way to finance capital improvements. And the reason being is you're pledging an irrepealable property tax to make that payment. And investors that are providing you with that capital are willing to settle for lower interest rates because they don't have to pay federal income tax on those interest rates. So it is a reasonable tax exempt debt under local governments is cheaper than almost any other way to raise capital. So that's the pro. The con to that is you are pledging an irrepealable property tax. So while you're anticipating the increment from the tax increment district to generate enough revenue annually to make those debt service payments, your risk is, and a disadvantage is, that if that revenue is short, you are either looking for other sources of funds to make the debt service payments, or you're levying your property tax owners to make the debt service payments, and so that would be a disadvantage. So that is the situation if the annual income from the TIF is insufficient to make those payments. I've listed here as well utility revenue bonds. So if projects are related to water improvements or sewer improvements, those can be financed with utility revenue bonds. The pros to that is it is also an economical way of financing projects, not as much so as general obligation because you're pledging the revenues of your utility. So the disadvantages of that are it is a little higher cost to finance, and that is because it's a little less secure investment to the, or it has a less secure collateral to the investor as general obligation debt. You also, because you're pledging your utility revenue, there's an expectation that your annual income from your utilities is at a certain level greater than that debt service payment, which we call a coverage level. So even though you may be expecting the tax increment district to make the payments, you would also have to have your revenues in place, your utilities, to actually be able to market the issue. The risk here, once again, is if that increment on an annual basis is insufficient to cover the debt service payment, the ratepayers would basically be on the hook to make those annual, or your utilities would be on the hook to make the annual debt service payments. So that's the disadvantage of that. Another item I didn't put on here would be what's referred to as TIF revenue bonds or community development revenue bonds. Those because this is a new district, there really isn't a market to place or sell those right at this point. If there were future costs in the future, or maybe a refinancing opportunity, those could be put in place. Investors at this point, what we're finding is they want a known revenue stream before they would commit to issuing or purchasing bonds in that fashion. And lastly, what we have identified here is developer-funded pay-as-you-go or PAYGO payments. You'll many times will refer to them as municipal revenue obligations, which is basically just the instrument that is put in place to represent that there's a potential future payment, and you can make those payments back after the close of the expenditure period. But what our next slide will kind of go into details of how this instrument works. The pros are it takes the risk off the local government and puts it onto the developer. A huge benefit. And so the disadvantages is you won't always find developers that are in a position to upfront the cost of doing the project or to collateralize that municipal revenue obligation to come up with the cash to do it. So that's probably one of the disadvantages, but it certainly is something what we try to encourage communities try to get negotiated in, because it forces the developer to perform. So with the next slide, I'll kind of show you how this works. So we'll go from the top of this model in a clockwise position. So we start out with, you've got a developer or a business owner that's come to the community and has asked for TIF assistance. And that may be for paying for utilities, it might be a direct development incentive, it might be something of that nature. So the way it would work is the developer then would pay for that cost upfront. So the developer would pay for the cost of putting the water into the site. We'll use that as our example. So once the water is there, the new development takes place, or the redevelopment is created, and there's new incremental value. That incremental value is going to pay taxes. And on the bottom of the slide, that district collects that incremental revenue from the collection of new taxes on that new development. And so the village collects the taxes, they go into the tax increment district. Moving up the chart to the left, then the village takes those tax collections and they use that revenue stream to reimburse the developer for those upfront project costs that they paid. So the developer is being paid back on a pay-go basis over a period of time as the value is collecting taxes on their new development. So as I mentioned, this shifts any burden or risk from the village issuing debt and puts all that risk back onto the developer. And it really does push performance by the developer, because they're not going to get paid if there isn't revenue available to reimburse them. And in the middle of this chart, the other protection with a municipal revenue obligation or a pay-go arrangement is if the revenue is not there, the village is not required to make that reimbursement payment. So it's hinged strictly on the availability of incremental revenue to make the payments on the bond. And with Corals working as the village's legal counsel, we typically have them structure these municipal revenue bonds with appropriate language that clearly protects that it's not a committed liability of the village, it's only contingent on, and payments are only made contingent upon available revenue. Now, what we have seen, though, and maybe the outcome of this development itself, is there may be some combination between municipally financed upfront and a portion of the request, if the village chooses to move forward with providing assistance, and a pay-go arrangement. So that's kind of a hybrid of the two, and that's probably more common of what we're seeing in some developments throughout the region. So moving then to our next slide, I talk a little bit more about developer agreements. So if you're issuing any development incentive or cash grant, you're required to have a development agreement. That's by state statute under the TIF law. However, any commitment of projects or cost into a program, I would, and you've got a developer working with you, it's just makes common sense to do this, and I'm sure the village would undertake that even if it wasn't providing any direct development incentives. So as part of those agreements, there's a few things that we encourage our clients to consider, and one is this pro forma review. And you have already engaged a member of our team to do this analysis for you, and this is an appropriate due diligence by the community to vet and address that but-for provision that Jonathan talked about earlier. It's really the way to determine that the amount of assistance that you're providing is appropriate to meet the needs of the project without providing too much assistance to benefit the developer. So developers do not come in and do developments if they're not going to make money. So you want them to do that. You want them to be successful, but you also want it to be a reasonable return on their investment. So that's, as Jonathan mentioned, the analysis of with and without assistance. What's that rate of return to the developer? We can assist in determining what should be appropriate, and if the level of assistance that they've requested is necessary or is too much. So I think one question is always is how much do we provide? So just because someone has come in and asked for a certain level of assistance doesn't mean that you have to provide all of it. You can determine what you're willing to support. Those are all decisions that can be made by the village. So if there's certain expenses you just absolutely don't want to provide assistance for, you can make those decisions internally. But the pro forma review will help you determine that level of assistance and will help in determining that combination of upfront versus pay-go. So a couple other things that I think are important as you move forward with any review of this project is that developer's agreement. We would encourage you to have a look-back provision. And many times you'll have developers that have pushed back on this, but I think it's really important because of a few things. When we're initially provided with the sources and uses on a development, they're estimates. It's the developer's estimates of what it's going to cost to construct the building, what, all their material costs, land acquisition, whatever their costs are, those are estimates. And I know I understand you've engaged an individual to help vet those numbers up front, but once again, they're still estimates. So we always encourage that a re-review of the pro forma is done after the actual costs are incurred, so that you now know what the real cost to the developer has been. And we also recommend that look-back provision be done at either a predetermined point in the future. We typically would look out 10 years. And the reason for that is there's an income stream especially on multifamily development. There's rent income to the developer, and there's an annual cash flow to the developer, or we call it a cash-on-cash return. Plus, at the point that property is sold, there's a value to that property. So we typically would look out at a point in the future, and that can be negotiated and determined. But in 10 years, if they were to sell that property, what's that property worth based on that income stream? And there's a rate of return for that. And there's a market expectation of what that return would be. However, we've also seen recently that many of these multifamily, they get built and then they get sold off. So if it gets sold before that future point in time, it should be done at that point of sale, because then you've got real data. What did they make at that point of sale when they sold? What was that revenue stream up to that point? What is their rate of return on that project? And part of that pro forma review and your negotiation and the development agreement is you will establish what their reasonable return level is. And so if it exceeds that either at the point of the sale or at that future point in time when that calculation is done, we suggest this clawback provision. And what happens there is if at the point the actual sales cost came in lower and it's a benefit obviously to the developer, you may be in a position to reduce the contribution to that project. As well as if that development takes place and you're to that second point of sale, and there's a return that's greater than what you agreed to at the time you negotiated the development agreement, you can share in that upside. So maybe you agree to a 50-50, 75-25, whatever, that the village could actually call back some of the contribution that they gave through the sharing of the upside of that return. Because and ultimately you don't want to over-enrich a developer for providing too much assistance up front. And typically what we see on these is you may agree on a rate of return at a certain point, and you want them to be successful in their development. You may say, okay, we'll go up a few percentages more than that before we'll split the upside rate of return. I also want to point out that you don't want to agree to the developer's agreement up front that you would, if their costs come in higher, that risk should be borne by the developer, and you would not share in providing more assistance because the costs come in higher. So this is the upside to the village, and maybe perhaps not to the developer, but those are just some things to consider as you draft your developer's agreement. And the next page, we're talking about a few other things that are, and your attorney, as this is done, will certainly advise you on what sort of protections you should put in place, especially if you're doing any of the upfront financing. So if the village is putting in all of the utility costs, these are some of the things that help protect the village. Your revocable letter of credit, sometimes those are attainable, sometimes not. It depends on the developer you're working with and their ability to have a bank issue one, but that certainly is probably one of your best protections in guaranteeing that if there isn't revenue available, you can tap into that to make sure your debt service payments are made. Performance bonds, mortgage liens, either on the property that's being developed or other properties. So if there is a default, you have something to fall back on. Assignment of securities or other collateral, restrictions on assignment of developer's agreement. So you can restrict whether they can assign this agreement off to somebody else or to a purchaser of the property. You certainly have the ability to withhold permits or other approvals over their head. And the last one is a personal guarantee. While these are done, they probably are the hardest thing to go after if there is a default on an agreement. So just some things that we wanted to kind of point out that give you some thought and ammunition as you draft your developer's agreements. We'll go through the last couple slides, and then we'll certainly open it up for question, but we just wanted to highlight the village has used this tool in the past. You currently have one district that's still out there. Tax increment district number 2 was created in 2004. There's a map. I don't know how I can't see it very easily, but so I don't know how easily it is to you, but you're probably more familiar with where this is located. When that district was created, there was about a $33 million base value, and as Jonathan said early on, that base value, the allocation of the taxes on that $33 million, is still going to all the overlapping taxing districts. So the TIF itself has increment value or new development value since its creation of about just under 39 or 37 million. It's the collection of taxes on that 37 million that is paying for project costs within that district as it's been going through its natural life. So in total, that area now is worth 70.4 million from its original 33.4 million. So that growth has been fairly, it's more than doubled in size. And our last final thoughts are, TIF still serves as the most important economic development tool available to local governments. And the value of TIF is since you're using the taxing power of not just the village, but all of the taxing entities, and those taxing entities will benefit from that district being created and that new value. If the but-for question is answered, that development wouldn't be there if you weren't using TIF. So those overlapping taxing districts are foregoing the tax revenue on that value during the life of the district. but by foregoing that, their dollars are also helping you pay for that, that economic development. So they're sharing in the cost of providing growth within the community, and they ultimately will benefit from that growth when that district is closed and that tax base becomes available for them for their operations and other uses. One thing I wanted to point out too is Jonathan talked about extensions of districts, and there is a standard extension that would be available under current state statute for this 27-year district. And that would be as if for whatever reason you were reaching the life end of that 27-year period and you had not recovered all your project costs, you can ask for an extension of 3 years. And if you can clearly demonstrate that it would not, then the JRB, obviously if you have an audit that demonstrates that it's not, they have to approve that extension. We have taken them to them and gotten them to voluntarily approve it without going through that extension. So just so you know, you've got 27 years plus perhaps an additional 3 years to recover project cost if needed. Hopefully if everybody does the proper due diligence and the developer performs, that you would never find yourself into that situation.
Dawn?
Yes.
If we, on the existing TIF that we have, can we extend it, period, if we add a new project to that district?
What, and we've had some of that discussion with staff already, and we will be looking to evaluate that extension for that district. So you can extend it if you're not going to be able to recover the project cost, but if we can also demonstrate to the Joint Review Board the benefit of undertaking an additional project that's going to value the area, and you need that additional time to recover those costs, they've been pretty amiable. We've done that in other communities. The only thing you have to remember is you can't take on a new project beyond its expenditure period. So, that would have to time out with that. But it is something that we're looking at with the village to try to perhaps do somewhat in conjunction with this new creation, or, independent of that, to get that additional project approved and the needed extension if it's needed.
For the other listeners, I was referring to redoing the Underwood Creek and financing that by an extension to the existing TIF.
But are we-
Appropriate use.
Are we hearing that it makes more sense to bring that up as its own project and to engage in a new TIF district on the merits of that new project?
No, it would be an extension of, the original project for that TIF was the stormwater project. We did not do the daylighting at that time for a myriad of reasons. This would be an addition to that original one, that original project plan. And it would be part of that original project, and it would be the extension of just those.
So you're saying the daylighting was part of the original project?
It was
and
part of the
then-
original design, but it got pulled out as we went along.
So it was not, I'm saying a yes and a no, it was not in the finalized original design?
It was not. It was not.
So it's
got-
tough to say it's an extension if it wasn't in the original finalized design, or yes or no? I'm
Well,
following.
it's a chicken and egg thing, because the plan when we created the TIF district was to do the stormwater plan, but the stormwater plan itself wasn't finalized at that time. We had rough estimates. We were going through the evaluative process, and it was determined that the daylighting of the creek at that point in time was too complicated, too controversial to try to get through that and get the project done in a timely manner. So it was set aside. The board said, we'll work with the DNR to get grants and other projects to try to do that later, but we're not going to add it to the scope of this one now.
Okay, so interesting on extension, but not the focus of today.
Right, and that would not be part of the Mandel TIF. More than likely, it would be part of an extension of the existing one. Two separate actions,
Right.
two separate TIFs.
Got it.
Dave, on the daylighting project, where does the revenue stream come from?
Comes from the existing property within the district. So it would be, you would be extending the life of the TID for those additional 3 years, which would generate additional revenue to be able to pay for the project.
piggybacking on the first.
Correct, correct. You're using the increment already created to fund that extension.
Can we go back a couple slides and look at what the TID district is and we're talking about? I was unclear on that.
I don't think
It
we've seen a
hasn't been
picture of it.
defined. That's the existing TIF.
Right.
Correct.
So,
Yeah, we don't have a map in our presentation of the proposed TID 3. And that, again, is we'll be working with the village to get that map, so before we start the public process. But, I think there's other decisions that the village is still needing to make before that area becomes final.
I'm just curious, does the TID include the cemeteries?
It more than likely will, yes.
Okay.
And the reason for that being that you'll notice on this particular map, you see, the triangle that juts down next to St. Mary's.
Right.
Those two cemeteries there butt up to the terrace condominiums. We want to potentially include the terrace condominiums in this TID so that we can utilize this TID to get water down to them, and then also include the BP gas station and the 1 Hour Mightonizing property as overlays to get the water underneath the railroad tracks, all as part of this TID district.
Yeah, and I'll make another comment, Dave, too, while you're mentioning that as we're talking about boundaries. When you create a district, they have to be they have to be located within your jurisdiction, that's no question. They have to be full, complete parcels. You can't split a parcel in half and have half of it in a district, half of it out. So at the time you create the district, those parcels need to be full and complete. And they have to be contiguous. So if you have multiple parcels, they have to connect. But you can cross roads, you can cross rivers, you can cross railroad tracks. So if the roads, rivers, railroad tracks were not there, the lines would touch. So you can even be kitty corner across the street as long as, the corners would touch each other. That would be considered contiguous. So I think the question with the cemeteries is, we need that to make our connections and make all the land contiguous, so.
Right.
And that's right now, and maybe I'm wrong, Dave, I don't know if that's still all within one piece of property and it's not been segregated away.
There is the St. Mary's Cemetery is in between the
Okay.
School Sisters Cemetery and the terrace condominiums.
Okay, I understand, okay.
And we can do overlays, in other words, a project for one TIF can overlay the
The
other
previous
TIF.
TID, yes. You want to explain
Yeah.
that, Dawn, how that works?
Yeah, so basically, you can create a new district and include part of an existing district into the new district. And what happens is the new district, so whatever that property that you're including in the new district, whatever its value today becomes part of the base value of the new district. So it's basically frozen in time in the old district as part of its increment. Becomes base value in the new district, so it's anything from the point that the new district just created going forward becomes value in that new district. So at the point you put it in a new district, it basically is part of that new district, even though the increment being collected in the old district will not be diminished by that. It's a way to continue to have that in the old district without subtracting the property, and then also kind of starting the clock over in the new district for that same land. So, bringing those properties in, as Dave mentioned, will enhance the abilities of this new district and help provide the ability to pay for those costs.
I have a question on local county school expenses within the district. So particularly for the one that's being recommended for the Sisters of Notre Dame, it's a number of residents, a number of families, and multiple people in that. Who, during this time period, who would be funding the local, county, and school expenses being needed by the folks that live in that area when the revenue from that area is going separately in the TID to repay the developer? Who pays for that for the 20 to 27 years?
Dave, you want me to jump in here?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, and I apologize, I'm gonna have to leave in a couple minutes, because I have a room filled with MMSD people down the hall that I gotta go meet with.
So to answer that is, you know, I don't envision there being a significant amount of, county expense associated with this, since, you know, most cost related to it would be within the village. But as far as schools are concerned, so this will provide, you know, potential for additional students in the school. Schools are held harmless under tax increment law. So the value of the district does not count against their funding formula while it's in the district. So schools are funded by property tax and state aids. And so when there's a TIF involved, you know, normally the property tax is based on how much tax base you have, and if you can collect this much in property tax, it reduces your state aid. So while the TIF's in place, the formula does not count that value. So the schools are held harmless. They're still, you know, they're getting a per capita per student. So if there's more students here, they'll benefit from their state aids. And at the point the district closes, you know, it may generate more revenues from their property tax base, and then it would potentially, most likely reduce their state aid need, but it would still balance itself out. So I would think that the biggest potential for cost moving forward with this area would most likely be the school district, and they'll be held harmless.
What about the local expenses of fire and
No,
police
the
and
point is,
managing it?
this parcel is not generating any tax revenue now.
But that's not
So-
generating these types of
so the
services
school
to the same
district
level.
is gonna have to bear the entire expense that it would normally get from property taxes to educate the new student. And the village during this TID period is not getting any money from this property to cover other expenses other than paying off the TIF costs. So the village is gonna have to bear some cost for fire and police and other services.
We will, so I just want to say it back to you to make sure I'm hearing you clearly. When we come to budget season, after this is developed, we will have expenses relative to X number of people in this district for local expenses. And we would bear that in our budget. We would have no
Yes.
revenue to offset those
Other-
expenses during the
Other than
TID.
to the effect that we might get state aid or some other aid for this parcel from, you know, outside the village.
Okay, can I ask another question? Relative to the district lines, relative to the standalone houses and then the multi-use portions of the development, who's able to actually set those lines to maybe exclude the standalone individual homes and compress the district around the multi-use areas? Can we actually move those lines? Who's responsible and has the authority to set those lines to wherever? We haven't seen a picture of it today. If we said, hey, we'd like it to be drawn in 3 different options, is that something that's in our authority to do?
The only comment I would have there is, you know, this parcel is one large tract of land. So if lines were going to be drawn in different ways, there would have to be a legal parcel split done before the district could be created, because they have to be full parcels when they come in. So if there was a portion of this that was going to be looked at and not included in the district, it would have to be, those parcels would have to be carved out by a recorded certified survey map, creating new parcels.
Sure, so okay, thank you, that helps.
The only thing, Martha, if I may comment, the single-family homes are being proposed by the developer to be serviced by municipal water. So we would want to include them in the district so we can provide, or use that to help provide the municipal water to them and finance it that way.
Thank you.
Speaking of which, that segues nicely to my question that occurred to me. Dawn, if I heard you right, you made some kind of a distinction to financing municipal water for the apartments versus the single-family homes?
Yes, the only TIF that you can provide benefit to newly platted residential development is a mixed-use district. So the blight district, the purpose is to eliminate blight and rehab the development to eliminate blight. So since there are single-family homes in this district, the TIF could not directly pay for the water service that benefits them. There could be a proration of those lines that provide them if there's a looping involved. So there's probably many ways to accomplish the developer's needs by providing incentives to them for the redevelopment, and then some of that cost may have to be segregated away and not TID eligible.
It's
So-
my understanding that the utility proposal for the apartments does include looping as a second source of, or a second input of water to the apartment site, and it would come down past all the single-family homes and then loop back in.
Right, so that piece of it, I think, would have to be prorated, that the TIF could pay for part of it. But if there's other benefiting properties from it, then those other benefiting properties would have to share in that cost.
What if we didn't, the village did not install the water line past the single-family homes, but the developer did that, possibly with some of the TIF money we gave them for others as part of the overall package for like, the removal of the existing buildings and some of the other remediation.
Well, as if there's no tie to, you could provide incentive to them for the multifamily, but I would be cautious on making it clear that, there's no link to that,
Okay, we give them a lump sum, but we don't tell them this
how
much
they
is for
spend
water.
it. Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
So-
And we wouldn't- yeah, okay.
Along the lines of water, the water will be coming down, and homes along that way, not in the TIF district and not new ones, are likely to want to connect. And you had said something about they would have to reduce the TIF by that amount. Could you
Yeah,
just talk
if
about
you-
that?
I would imagine that you would probably have a connection charge for them to connect to that water. It would be that connection charge that would have to offset the cost of
But
having
not
put the
a
water there.
development charge?
So if you charge a connection charge for them to connect to it, then you could use that connection charge as a revenue into the TID. It helps pay that debt service, but it clearly then distinguishes that money wasn't, their benefit was erased by the fact that they paid the connection charge, and you reduce the TID cost accordingly.
And we've done that with the water line that we put in for the Heritage Senior Living Center that brought it in from Brookfield up Elm Grove Road. And there is a connection fee based on a proportionate share of that installation of costs for the other properties to connect.
I'm gonna take another run at the TID lines just for amusement, so I appreciate this. We're talking about perhaps going back to the mixed use definition rather than the blighted definition. Would we be able to get closer to a mixed use definition of district if, again, we brought the district closer to the multiple units rather than the single family unit, so that the percentage of the multiple, the apartments would be a higher percentage of the development district? And is that another way to
Yeah.
find ourselves under mixed use rather than blighted?
Well, here's the rules for a mixed-use development. As Jonathan explained, that you have to have two of three proposed purposes: industrial, commercial, and residential. So we won't have any industrial, I don't believe, in this area. So we would have residential and we would have commercial because we're bringing in the Martinizer and I believe the gas station. So you would have two purposes. But the other rule under a mixed-use district is no more than 35% of the geography, the area, can be for residential development. And while a multifamily might be assessed as a commercial property, the state views it as a residential living facilities, and so they call that residential. So you would have to bring in a huge amount of commercial area to enlarge that district to reduce the amount assigned to that multifamily, if that's all you were putting into it, to be less than 35% of the acreage.
I don't think we could do it even if we enclose the entire existing TID, because the school system is such a large parcel. Look at that map.
And then, you know, the single family home, I mean, the intent of the TIF law was never really to provide its development for single family homes. I mean, that's basically what it is. So if they do allow single family homes, they want to see the density of those homes to be at least 3 units an acre. So those are pretty small lots, and I don't envision that these single family homes meet that. Now, you could probably argue that the average with the multifamily and single family home would get you that less than 3 units an acre on average. But it, you know, as I said to Dave, you don't want to be a poster child of someone to come in and point fingers as to why you provide TIF assistance to a residential development of that magnitude.
But the multifamily is considered a residential for your research.
It absolutely is. They've even concluded, the Department of Revenue has even concluded that nursing homes and memory care facilities and all of those types of places are also residential because they provide living facilities for people. So even though they may be a commercial operation, they are a residential use.
Could we ask a question? Is that sure? Excuse me, Dawn, I wonder if you can hear me, but could we go back to something at the very beginning? You talked about having to have an area more than 50% covered by blighted buildings. If we're looking at this parcel, it's 30 acres. There is no way that the school sister buildings are covering 15 acres. So how do we even meet the minimum standard? Or did I misunderstand that portion?
Yeah, what we typically do is, that's right now one big large parcel.
Okay.
So we would call that parcel as being blighted because of the facility that's on it.
Okay.
So that would get us to that 50%. So when we provide the details to the Department of Revenue, you know, we will identify that as one parcel, we'll call it blight, and then that will give us that 50% finding.
But that's what I'm asking. It's a 30-acre parcel. The buildings are nowhere. The buildings are maybe 3-4 acres. I don't even think they're that. They're a couple of acres on that property. How do we get to 50%?
Because we'll count the whole parcel as being blighted.
It's okay. So, but maybe I'm missing something. The definition you said, 50% of the acreage has to be covered by a blighted building.
What we do is we just track all the acreage and we do it by parcel. So every parcel will have its declaration of it, whether it's blighted or not. We would look at the parcel as one entity and say if it's 30 acres, then we have a 30-acre blight parcel.
So what you're doing is you're carving into smaller blocks. So let's say you take a 2-acre section that the school sister building sits on. If the school sister sits on that 2-acre parcel that's in the 30-acre parcel, if you can call the 2 acres blighted, then you can call the 30 acres blighted? Is that what you're saying?
We're just calling the whole parcel blighted.
Right now, it is one parcel.
Yeah, it's one parcel.
And the fact that the buildings are only on a small part doesn't matter. It makes the whole parcel, because if you're gonna buy the parcel right now, you're gonna buy all the blighted buildings along with it.
I understand, George, but I'm not trying to be argumentative, but I thought she said one of the definitions was you needed to have 50% coverage of an area by.
Yeah, and I meant, the chart that we provide to the Department of Revenue identifies each parcel. And once we identify a parcel as being blight, we identify the whole parcel as blight. So that gives us the 50% area.
Okay.
So we'll have a chart that we put in there that says, this parcel is 30 acres and it'll be considered blight. And so that's 30 acres of our total acreage will have a blight designation.
Can I also ask, again, not to split hairs?
I mean, maybe it doesn't make logical sense in terms of that, but it's,
No,
that's
the
how we
acreage
run the
doesn't,
calculation.
but we'll move on, no problem. The school sisters are currently living in that building. The day they move out, it's blighted. Is that, I mean, I'm just asking, can we make that qualification? I mean, it hasn't sat idle, they are living in it today, tomorrow they will not. Today they're living in a blighted facility, or do I misunderstand that?
I would say that that property, even if they're living there, I mean, you can drive down different parts of different jurisdictions and see dilapidated buildings and people are still living in them. They would fit the statutory definition of blight.
Okay.
So there's contamination in the facility, or there's potential contamination remediation that's necessary. They're obsolete buildings. I mean, those types of things are what gets you to that blight finding. I mean, we can also do it as a rehabilitation. I mean, the property obviously needs to be rehabilitated. Gives you the same 27 years. It's a similar statutory finding, but either one of them I think gets you. And I think that the goal is to be able to do the projects, and it can't be done in mixed use, can't be done in industrial. So a blight or rehab district are your only two options.
How confident do we feel about defining financial success for the parties involved as this unfolds over time? I know we want both parties to be successful, not overly a fair deal. Do we have a lot of experience and confidence in our ways that we will be managing that proactively after we say yes to the terms?
Well, I think that once the pro forma is complete, I mean, we've seen this developer in many places in southeastern Wisconsin, and they've done many successful projects. So I think you should feel comfortable in knowing that you've got a good developer that you're partnering with. I think once you get through the pro forma analysis and you determine the amount of assistance you're providing and you come to an agreement on that, I think the key is that developers agreement and, what protects the village and what holds the developer's feet to the fire to ensure they perform.
And
And
that's
I
why,
don't think we have the answers to that today because we haven't gone through all those exercises yet.
Thank you.
but that's why we paid Ehlers in the past to crunch the numbers, look at what the developer is proposing in costs and so forth, and they've given us advice on how this is gonna play out.
Will we be relying on Ehlers to do that same activity for us? I don't know whether we were expecting that today, or is that something in front of us that Ehlers will be providing?
Ehlers is still working on it.
Yeah, our staff person, and Jonathan and I spoke with him just even as recently as yesterday, the day before. He's been in contact and has gotten information from the developer. So I know they're working through that exercise now. I think that'll be the first thing that will help you guys make the decision of moving forward, will be the outcome of that analysis. And then once you have a term sheet and agreement, then your attorney or legal support will draft a developer's agreement around that and put all the provisions to protect the village. So I think, the first questions you have to ask and answer, and I think you'll get to those points, are, one, do you want this project? Two, are you willing to partner and provide some support to making the project happen? And three, what's the level of that support? And, if you get those questions answered and the developer, you can get to terms with the developer that they're willing to go forward with it, then one of the other analysis we do is to make sure that the value they anticipate developing will be sufficient to cover any cost that you're providing, any support that you're willing to provide.
Dawn, and when you do these sort of TIFs, or these are done, who who manages the ongoing project? You know, for example, in a year or so after the structure is partially built, who determines what level of financing has been required, what level of money has been used, whether that was actually built to the standards? Who does the management of the project going forward?
Well, I think it comes down to, obviously your staff will be involved as they do with anything that's developed in the community. There's monitoring of the development itself. I think it comes down to also the amount of funding and how you're funding the project. On a pay-go basis, and you've got one of those in place now, there's a payment that's made on an annual basis. That's determined basically by your finance staff, how much is paid out every year. In terms of monitoring the actual performance of the construction, I mean, there'll be dates and times where certain things have to be done, and a lot of that will be monitored by staff. That's why TIF is allowed to cover those costs. There'll be certain things, right now I think you have Concord Group engaged to review these costs. I've actually seen communities have them engaged to oversee the construction of things and ensure that, especially and I guess one of them will be who's putting the utilities in place. Is that going to be a project that's run by the village, or is it going to be a project that's run by the developer? And you may have someone monitoring it if it's run by the developer to make sure that it's being done to the appropriate standards. That can be done by staff. You've certainly got public works staff that perhaps can monitor that, or you can have outside services do that, and then the TIF can help support those costs as well.
I have a question.
But staff will be involved.
I have a question going back to the earlier question with regards to the cost. Right now, there's no tax base to this property. And with the addition of all the apartments and the homes, we're gonna have additional costs to the schools. The one gentleman up there mentioned that, well, the state fund would have to make up the difference. But we're gonna have, 20 to 27 years of additional cost to the school system with additional students and with additional services on EMG?
The schools get aid based upon pupil count.
Mm-hmm.
So if it adds pupils to the schools, there'll be state aid to support that. And if there's not property tax base, that's why the schools are held harmless in this, because they don't want schools to be in a situation where they have students that they can't afford to.
Yeah, where you said they won't be penalized by the additional things, so they won't lose state aid. But you're saying
No,
basically,
they will probably gain, if you gain students, you're gonna gain
Aid.
support.
do we know where state aid's going with the amount of being offered to schools to pay for students' costs? Because there's, plus you got emergency services, you got police, you got all these additional costs for 20 to 27 years without being able to take any revenue out of this to pay for those costs to the city. So to me, that looks like that's a very additional cost. We're going to rely on the state for additional money to cover these students for 20, 27 years, not knowing exactly what the state will do. How much funds?
This is really a conversation we have to have later, once we have Ayler's report and are looking at Mandel's specific project. This TIF may pay it off relatively shortly, in less than 27 years, because it's got a zero tax base now. And so 100% of the new value, which is, if you include the single family homes, was estimated at 70 billion, at least.
George, I do
Besides
understand.
besides that, the school district has to sign off on it and say it's okay. They do, they go through that.
As part of the joint review board, yes.
Review, the joint, WCTC and the county, they all get together and they all have to sign off on it.
I
and
guess,
say
I
it's
guess their question is, and it may be fairly simple, is there will be additional costs for those students. The question is, if it's state monies, meaning does that cost get laundered through the entire state? Meaning every resident in the state is paying into the state pool is then paying for those students. Or are funds earmarked saying, hey, those students are coming out of the Elmbrook system, meaning that we need money from the state to pay for those Elmbrook students, and Elmbrook residents will be taxed. So is it more specific or is it general? Maybe that's a better way to ask the question. Does that make sense?
That's a better question to ask the school district, not.
Yeah, but
I
I'd like to
would
jump back
agree.
into what George was saying, the short time frame, but the data that was out there was 20 years on the payback scenarios with the different options, with it's like a 50-50 split or 100%, the city, and it was over a 20-year with the projected revenues from the created value, and it was a 20-year basically payout with like not breaking even cash flow wise till like year 5. And I know this is a separate discussion, I don't need to go here, but I want to talk about the risk. Because the lady earlier was mentioning that the risk associated with the 3 different options of funding, the first 2 being more city-based, us bonds or, our own revenue created, that risk being if the revenue is not created to pay the debt obligation, that obligation then falls on, and she mentioned either like the tax base or the revenue. Who absorbs that risk? Are you talking about the current taxpayers then would have to cover the cost if the revenue doesn't cover the debt obligation?
Yes, under the first two scenarios.
Well, is that what you were saying?
It falls onto the general taxpayers, yes, but that's why we're having Ehlers crunch all the numbers.
I understand,
In
but
the
then,
past, they told us that there's no risk in the couple of funding, TIP funding operations we proposed. They crunched the numbers. For example, the Heritage Senior Center is paying better than expected. So that's way, that's succeeding, just like Ehlers predicted it would. But we did have the safeguard of the pay-go operation there if it didn't succeed. So we'll wait and see what Ehlers proposes and what they recommend as far as clawbacks or pay-go to help us prevent the TIF from going underwater and the property owners in the village getting stuck with it.
yeah, I understand, and that's, but there is risk associated with it. Otherwise, the lady would say there is no risk,
But it's minimum risk in this particular situation with Mandel since they've got a 0 tax base now.
Well, yeah, but we have additional costs that would be created by this property. The whole city was going to be impacted by the additional traffic, the additional impact on the streets, the cost on the streets, cost on the need for sidewalks. There will be additional costs based on the 10% plus additional thing. But it's not the discussion area, I know, for this now. But with regards to the, another question with regards to the specific cost. The review that you're doing right now with the Ehlers doing on the but-for process. When you do the but-for, are you looking at their specific request? Are you doing a but-for with regards to other potential developments that aren't being evaluated? You're just looking
I
at.
have another commitment, I'm gonna sign off now, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. It is specific to the Mandel development. So Mandel will provide us their cost to build, their cost to acquire. They'll provide us everything it will cost them to put the development in place. They will provide us with their projected income stream on rental of those properties. So we will be able to independently review what sort of money they will make by doing this thing. And with the outcome to be able to give you comfort in knowing that what you're providing, at least based upon the initial information, is not too much. So that will come back to you with this is what their return would be without assistance, this is what their return would be with the full amount of assistance, this is what their return should be under data that we have for our region, and if what they're getting with the TIF assistance is too high, then it helps you determine how much is appropriate, and we'll help work through that. So that's what that pro forma review will do.
So a lot of your questions are things to come that isn't specific to the TIF here. And unless you have more questions, George is already gone. Other finance people still on the line, do they have more questions?
A very quick question for Dawn. Dawn, if we choose to back the financing with bonds and take a lien against the property, is that lien a first position or second position?
Those will be things that you need to negotiate. So, I've seen communities try to get first position. I think the complicated part with that is if they have bank financing for the construction, banks are gonna want that first position, so they may not, step down to provide it to the city. So that's why some of these other things are, I think what you wanna be able to do is guarantee that if the increment's not there and you've bonded for it, that they're gonna make up that shortfall. And, the letter of credit is one way to do that. You can put what we call springing special assessments too, that if it's utility cost and it's not enough money to cover it with the increment, you spring a special assessment, which comes before the mortgage. So there's ways to accomplish that.
Okay.
Any other questions from finance individuals? Christina, I see you're on. Do you have a question?
I don't, but thank you very much, Dawn. I really do appreciate your time. I'm sorry I was a little late jumping on.
Okay. So,
Thank you, Dawn and Jonathan, we appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All
Thanks
right,
for taking the
talk
time.
soon.
Take care.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Don had asked, this was not a question for Don, so I didn't ask.
Yeah.
She said something along the lines of, there's a third party other than Ellis that is reviewing, is that Concord Group?
Concord Group is
We're
a
not gonna listen.
company that we hired to evaluate the actual construction.
Bring
Our
them back
specialty is construction.
Okay, and so Ellis is for the financing, Concord is for today's costs.
Yeah.
This is a terrible year to